Hi, everyone, and welcome to the webinar about the role of community engagement in evaluations in service of racial equity. I'm Kian Lee from Community Science. Let me ask Dante to first introduce himself and then Alicia.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dante Cowens, and I am at Community Science as a research assistant. Today, I'm going to be behind the scenes with logistics and any technical issues. And thank you for being here today.
Thanks, Dante. Alicia.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Alicia Nance. I am an educator and community organizer, a farmer, and somatic abolitionist that works as a consultant, working with organizations that are working to make spaces what we like to call worthy of community and young people. And so specifically I'm working with a lot of the things that Ken is going to be talking about today. So I'm super excited to be here and to learn from y'all.
Thank you. Thanks, Dante and Alicia. So unfortunately, Wilan Kren from the Kellogg Foundation can't be with us today as she does the introduction, but we have a recording of her welcome, and I'm going to play it as if she were here. But for those of you who know her, you know there's nothing like having Wilan live in any meeting or webinar.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Wilan Kren. I welcome you to today's webinar. Today's webinar is actually a follow-up of the Kellogg Foundation's release of a new publication, a three-part series of practice guides. And the title is right here, Doing Evaluation in Service of Racial Equity. These guides aim to provide evaluation professionals like yourself with concrete how-to knowledge on incorporating racial equity as the core value in designing and implementing evaluation activities. It's much easier said than done, of course. A series of practice guides complement and also supplement the other resources the Kellogg Foundation created, such as Logic Model Development Guide, Step-by-Step Guide to Evaluation, How to Become Savvy Evaluation Consumers. So about the guides, why did the Kellogg Foundation commission these guides? It's partially and first and foremost because of the Kellogg Foundation's long-standing commitment to racial equity, so much so that in 2015, our CEO and the president, LeJeune Montgomery Tabron, officially named racial equity, including racial healing, leadership development, and community engagement as our DNA. That means racial equity is embedded in everything that we do, including evaluation. Back in 1999, if you were born yet at that time, the Kellogg Foundation seed funded the American Evaluation Association's Building Diversity Initiative, explicitly focusing on diversifying the evaluator pipeline and promoting culturally competent evaluation practices. Decades later, along with many of you, we are actually taking it beyond diversity and the cultural competency, and we are embarking on the journey of equitable evaluation. And so in summary, doing evaluation to advance racial equity agenda in service of racial equity is part of who we are. It's also our core value. It's part of our history. It's also part of our mission at the Kellogg Foundation. I hope these guides will help enhance your role in our collective journey of challenging the status quo and dismantling systemic racism, no matter where we are and each one of us are on this journey. And I thank you again for participating in today's webinar. And I also challenge you to explore these guides and begin using them in your own racial equity work with your colleagues, grantees, partners, stakeholders, clients, and the communities that you live as well as serve. I'm very grateful for Dr. Tian Li from Community Science to author these guides. We just commissioned it, and she actually did all the work of writing it. So today you are in for a treat with this brilliant and distinguished leading evaluator, Dr. Tian Li. Now I'm turning it back to you, Kian.
So if we
Good
land with
afternoon, everyone.
So if Wilan were here, I would certainly thank her. And I still want to thank her, even if she's not here, because I really, her support and her commitment to racial equity has just been astounding. And she and I share so many aspects of our journey together as two Asian women who migrated to this country and struggle together to fight structural racism through our evaluation practice. And I also want to say that it's just not all my work. Certainly the team at Community Science has been just incredible at supporting the development of these guides, the writing of these guides, and the feedback as well. And a shout out to the people who reviewed the drafts. There were certainly many thought leaders in the field, practitioners, evaluation practitioners, as well as social justice leaders who reviewed drafts of the guides and gave us feedback. Before I continue, I'm noticing a lot of questions in the chat and in the Q&A about whether the recording from the last session will be available. Yes, it will be. We're actually running the 3 sessions. The last one will be on Thursday. And so what we're going to do is we're going to consolidate everything and send it all out, everything out in one email, all the recordings and the links to the resources and all. That way, people don't have to go looking for 3 different emails, it'll all be one. So just in response to the questions that are coming through. So in today's webinar, we're going to focus on what community is and what does community engagement mean and look like in evaluations in service of racial equity. What makes it different since we talk about community engagement in any evaluation. As I did in the first webinar, my colleagues at Community Science have taught me about setting the table from the start by saying a few things about myself. I came to learn about community in different ways. The community I knew growing up was made up of my neighbors, the aunties, the uncles, sisters, and brothers. We called everybody this, regardless of whether they were related to us or not, who watched over me after school, who brought us food when my mother was terminally ill, and who participated with my father in the neighborhood watch program. The community I became part of when I first arrived in the US was a network of students of color and foreign students on campus. And we took care of each other during winter and summer holidays when students like me could not go home to be with family. Another community that I came to know in my adulthood is my husband's community, which spans the DC, Maryland, Virginia area and is made up of friends, relatives, and acquaintances who fled the many wars in Afghanistan. These are all communities made up of relationships that share an identity or an experience, even though these relationships were developed and function in different settings, a neighborhood, a college campus, and an urban area. The word community gets thrown around a lot. And it can mean many different things. Community-driven strategies, community-led initiatives, school community partnerships, community leadership programs, community technology programs, community policing, community engaged practices. In all these terms, community implies a physical place, an ideology, a network, and many more things. So what is community? A community is made up of people and relationships based on some sort of connection. The connection can be the place they live in, can be their history, their racial identity, and anything else. If you're not part of a community, you can't define what connects the people in that community. It is not up to you to define their community, it is theirs to define. If people and relationships make up a community, then there are some things we should remember about community. There are communities within a community. If we assume that people who look the same belong to one community only, or have the same experience belong to one community only, we assume wrongly. It may appear that way to the outsider, but because a community is made up of people and relationships, people form relationships based on different things that connect them and on the different needs they might have at the time. And so they can belong to many different types of communities all at the same time. Community leadership comes in different forms. The person or persons with influence over a set of relationships, over a group of people, come in different forms. Frequently, we assume that the executive director of a community organization is a leader. That may or may not be true. Right? It can be someone who's a spiritual leader and has a daytime job at the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. And this is true, by the way. This person does exist. He's not a fictional figure. There was also, when we did a study, we learned about a leader who was a professor before he came to the US as a refugee. And he would hold court or have these meetings at the local Starbucks on weekends. And people from his community would come over and sit and listen to him and talk to him and ask him for advice and information. So leaders come in different forms, formal and informal. Communities evolve and change. We assume that communities are static. If community is made up of people and relationships, and we all know that relationships are not static, then how can communities be static? Yet we report our findings about community as if they are the permanent truth, right? It's really a snapshot in time, and we have to remember that. If community is a set of relationships and not something you can easily see or touch, how do you learn who the community is? There are multiple ways, not a single way. The more ways you use, the more comprehensive your understanding of the community will be, because you'll be learning about the community from multiple angles. So let's start with the most obvious one, right? Looking at the community and looking at the demographic makeup. This is based on the assumption that people who have shared identities are likely to have relationships, regardless of locality. Also, as mentioned before, they may have multiple identities they share with different sets of people. So, in looking at data and demographic data, it will be helpful to not only disaggregate the data by a single form of identity, but look at the intersection of identities, such as race and gender, race, gender, and income, race, sexual orientation, and income. And I know that this data is not always available easily, so we have to supplement whatever administrative or secondary data we have with sometimes, data that we collect by ourselves. Communities are organized to support their members. Like it or not, the community is organized. We may not see it, but there are organizations and networks, and organization with a small o, right? But there's organizations and networks that serve and support the community, that fulfills the community needs, that help to connect the members. Right? And they are usually managed formally or informally by some leader, a group of leaders, a group of people. You can learn and find out about these organizations and networks and the people who are managing them in various ways, right? If there's a local newspaper, a neighborhood newspaper, a newsletter that connects the people across the country. You can listen to the local radio stations and find out, who gets invited to speak, on radio shows. You can visit the websites and learn about these organizations or these networks and, contact the person who's listed there. Most important, when you do find that person and you connect with that person, you want to ask these questions. How would you describe the community you work with or in? Who do community members turn to for help, for information, for resources? Are there differences among the members that distinguish one group from another, so that you can start to see if there are communities within communities? And what are the community's issues and concerns? So you have the demographic breakdown now, you know who's in it. You get to understand a little bit more about, how they interact with one another in it. Hopefully each time you're doing this, your understanding of the community and learning who the community is getting deeper and deeper. If it's a physical place, you can visit it. I say drive around, visit local restaurants, corner stores, convenience shops, barber shops, but caution that you might not always want to do this yourself, especially if you're really as an outsider. So how do you actually connect that with a bridge builder? You may be the person that you identified in the ways that I talked about in the last slide, through the organizations and networks, speaking to them, having them accompany you, and doing some of these visits. And again, the kind of questions you want to ask, whether you're asking the bridge builder or you're asking people you come into contact with, who do people turn to for help, for questions, for resources, for information? In what ways do people get involved in the community? What types of civic activities are there, or volunteer activities? Because not everybody sees them as civic activities. It could be just helping my neighbor. And what issues bring people together or divide people? I remember a study that we did at Community Science, where through this kind of process where we connected with bridge builder after bridge builder and asked these questions about who do people go to for information, we uncovered a whole layer of networks and organizations that support communities. One of them was a Boy Scout program for young boys from Vietnamese American families. And this Boy Scout program, the guy who runs it, obviously the parents really turned to him for support and for questions, because he was not only teaching their children their culture, he was a connection to other kinds of activities, youth activities, right, in the metro area. So if you ask these questions, I think that you will start to uncover layers and layers of leadership and people who are connected. The last one is really, examining data about the health, education, housing, and other outcomes of the community or people in that community. And here you're looking for disparities between groups, because it'll start to help you understand the conditions and the circumstances that affect people in that community. By the way, no pattern of disparities is also data, right? So when you're looking at the data, you're looking for other differences between groups, within groups. What are the differences in how people are treated, right? If they're trying to access resources or information, what are the root causes contributing to the disparities and inequities people might be bringing up and saying they experience? Who are the leaders and advocates on these issues, related to those root causes? You want to connect with them. You'll learn about community from them, through them, and then deepen your understanding. What challenges do people face? What successes have they faced, right? So not only just like hopefully not coming to at it from a deficit, a deficiency kind of perspective, but also what are the strengths? What are the assets? Because those those organizations and networks that you uncover are actually real assets in communities. So with this, just talking about defining what community is, and how do you begin to learn about community, I'm going to pause. I'm going to invite Alicia to say a little bit about this. So Alicia, do these notions of community resonate with how you understand community through your work in community organizing and with young people in particular? And what else should evaluators know about community?
Ken, thank you so much. I was writing down feverishly notes to think about things, that new connections based on from the past time that we talked. And I think, yes, in many ways, this resonates for me because I am also a, higher education trained, right, dissertation approved, right, person who went through this process of really understanding community, or thinking I needed to understand community from a very clinical way, as if I didn't grow up in and among, right, communities myself, that I already understood from my own familial and communal epistemologies, right? And so those ways of knowing have been challenged oftentimes in our formal education and kind of what is valued in that formal education. And so in many ways, yes, all of the things that we're talking about around community and how communities form and see relationships between each other and having a shared experience and those kinds of things are super, super important to saying yes. I just wonder, it always concerns me when I'm attempting to define community for some other community, because it's not my place, right? And so it's really not about the definition that is a concern for me. I believe the relationships and processes through which we come through to these definitions is really what is more a focus to me, that brings it into focus to me. And so if I am attempting to define a community that is not mine, right? Little C community, big C community, right? Or even my village, which is the closest community that I have, which are the people who are in shared struggle with me, who know my business, right? As one of my colleagues, Shauna Murray Brown, says with Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle in Baltimore, she talks about there are different layers of community, as you talked about, and you really have to understand those layers of community and why folks define themselves that way. And so what I may define as community, what my family may define as community, may differ from somebody next door. And so the definition, while it's great, it's really how we operationalize this definition and how we use this definition to continue to think about the people that we're working to get to know, or the community that we're getting to know, right? And so my questions for me that I always ask myself are, when I'm trying to define this, am I working with folks? Is it consensual? Is the conversation that I'm having consensual? Is it one that has been forced upon the folks that I'm talking to? And is there reciprocity? What are these folks getting out of this by answering my questions, by engaging me, right? Because there is a very different layer of what I understand from community organizing, being that I'm working with communities that I am living with, that I have shared struggle with. The answers are different. The way we talk to people are different. So we may give an answer because we feel that we have to, right? That it's been put upon us, that it's not a consensual relationship and there is no reciprocity. There's nothing that we are gaining from this relationship with whomever is asking the questions. And so we can often come to a very sterile definition because folks do a lot to survive. And so many communities are studied over and over and over again, right, in many iterations, and they have learned how to navigate a less than worthy process, right, when thinking about this idea of worthiness. And so that's where my concern is. And really, that's what I would want evaluators to be able to answer, right? What else do they need to know about community, but what else do they need to know about themselves in relation to those communities to be able to talk about what are the gaps, what are the strengths that I bring, but what are the gaps? What are the places where I need to figure out how I can position myself in a way that means that, because I don't believe that any of the work that we are doing can be equitable if the relationships and processes through which we're doing them are not equitable in and of themselves. And so I hope that makes sense. But like the definition is in and of itself, okay.
Yeah, definitely makes sense. So I can say for me, the definition is important because I think it was not about imposing what is a community or who says what that community is. I think it's oftentimes we think of community as like static and we think of community as that building in the corner, right? But really it's about relationships. It's about who I can turn to when I need somebody, when I need support. And so it's really about relationships, and relationships is not something you can see. Right? Something you can touch. And I think that's important for us to remember as evaluators.
Sure, that's part of that's part of the thing that I'm talking about. Like, I don't think we think about community as this thing over there when we're talking about our communities.
Yeah, right, exactly.
It's when we shift into the perspective of researcher, evaluator, right? When we take this different persona than all the other identities that we have, child, parent, sibling, right? Whatever it is, we understand community in a different way. And my question is, how do we bring in, right, the definition that we live and breathe every day, which is messy, which, right, is not sterile. It is not trying to divorce the humanness, right, which is messy from the definition. How do we bring that into a practice or a field that does not necessarily allow for such messiness?
You're absolutely right. And I think what was mentioned in the first webinar that I think is important to mention here is that, like, I also think evaluators can't change this alone, right? It's a whole ecosystem of players, from funders to evaluators to nonprofits. I mean, there's a whole ecosystem of people that have to shift their thinking, right, to be able to make this real. But I'm curious, I want to ask you, actually, there's a question in the chat, in the Q&A that I think is very timely. Is there anything that we shouldn't ask? You know, like all the questions I listed just now about how do you learn about community, is there'll be questions like who's not involved, why do people not trust or turn to for help, who do people not trust? Are those questions also questions we should ask?
I think that oftentimes, like, I do not posit myself as someone who can tell you that you can take this cookie cutter thing and do it in every community. There are different ways in which communities define what works and doesn't work for them and its members. And I think those are the types of things. I love the process through which you ask these questions, right? Questions are our entry point into understanding things. And I think the more questions we can generate, the better we get at trying to figure out how to have complex conversations with folks. And so it's not about whether or not you can ask these questions. It's about whether or not you have the relationship you've cultivated the relationships to start to have folks let you know what the boundaries are around that, right? Because I believe that there is a level of accountability that has to be there in order for you to be in real right relationship with people, right? That's what I talk about, this consensual relationship where there's some reciprocity. So there needs to be some give and take. So sometimes folks can let you know and can answer these questions. I also, just in learning about my work with young people, for instance, which my young people tell me I'm not part of their community anymore in the way of like young people, because I'm old now, as they tell me, even though I taught them for many years. Now I'm too old. And they, you know, but not being part of that community, one thing is a lot of things are learned in what folks don't say. And so you can start to learn things without having to actually ask a pointed question. I think sometimes the space in conversations provides you with a lot of information as well. I hope that helps.
Yeah, it definitely does. Thank you. You know, I think what you said is important. It's just, it's the relationships, is in what relationship are you in to be able to ask which questions, I think. And it goes back to, I think, what you said earlier, right? It's that it requires a reflection of ourselves and who we are, right? And what kind of relationship do we want, and what we have to be able to ask these questions.
And even then, right, like there are questions that I, based on my positionality, still wouldn't ask, because I may not be the best positioned person based on my relationship, right? Like my juxtaposition, my identity, right? Like for instance, with young people, sometimes I am not able to ask that question in a way that will get to what needs to get to be gotten to, as well as a young person, someone who is their age. And I have to honor that there are many strengths to my positionality, but there are also areas where I just have to say, that's why I have to get in relationship with folks, because I am unable to do this by myself. It is not something that is a solo pursuit, even though we like to set it up that way. The lone researcher, right? And doing things that really, it doesn't work.
Right. Great. Thank you. I'm going to move to the next session about community engagement. I just want to let folks know that, you know, I'm monitoring the Q&A, and some of these questions that I'm also posing back to Alicia, and this back and forth are actually coming from participants in real time. So let's talk a little bit about community engagement now that we've talked about community. What does engaging community mean in doing evaluations in service of racial equity, right? And community engagement comes up in evaluation in general. It always comes up, especially if we're evaluating a community development initiative, community-driven initiative, any of that sort. So what makes it different or special in evaluations in service of racial equity? To me, and I think this is based on everything I've heard, everything we've learned, all the mistakes we've all made, you know, as evaluators, it's really about being intentional in moving community towards developing the power to influence decisions that affect their lives, right? As evaluators, we have some role in this, like it or not. And so, you know, saying this is easy, doing it is really hard, because the angels are in the details, as my friend David Chavez would like to say. We have to be intentional about designing an approach that supports community developing and strengthening its own power along the way, increasing the community's access to resources and opportunities that historically it has not had access to, right? And sometimes this is not possible for all kinds of reasons, because of the status quo and just the way things are set up. So as evaluators, I feel like we have to be intentional about creating those opportunities, and also educating funders and our partners along the way about how to make sure that we're doing things that are moving communities towards having more access to resources and opportunities and power to influence decisions that affect their lives, right? And not leaving it to others to make those decisions. So I think that's how it's different in evaluation in service of racial equity. One of the ways to do it is do your homework, right? Move beyond the community leaders, beyond the obvious choices. As I said before, community leaders are not necessarily the person who's the loudest or the most opinionated, or the person who's the director of the community organization. It can be, it doesn't have to be. If you stop there and don't go further, then you're missing really a whole layer of community leadership that you want to engage with, be in relationship with, and support, right? You're not able to do this because you're not familiar with the community's history, culture, and context. So it's about learning that. I think, Alicia, when you and I talked before, it's that this is not ahistorical. That really stuck with me, right? Understanding history and a community's history is really part of this process, and understanding the community and the leadership that's in place, because the leadership is also shaped by that history and the culture of that community. I think being mindful, I think, about the nature of relationships between yourself as the evaluator with different groups of community members, but also between different groups of community members, right? Evaluation is political, despite the myth that it's supposed to be bias-free and objective. It is not, because it generates information, and information is power. So even as evaluators, we have to be mindful about how we are perceived, either as representing sometimes our race and our ethnicity, or representing the funder, because we're out there. And the funder can be the foundation, it could be a federal government, it could be a big national nonprofit, it could be a corporation. So we have to be mindful of that, our own work about ourselves. I think as we learn about the nature of relationships in the community, we are also responsible for helping others understand it, that we come into contact with, especially the funder, and then connecting the community leaders to the resources and opportunities that the funder might actually have. Years ago, when community science was conducting a study about the needs of immigrant families and low-income families of color in Montgomery County in Maryland, the funder was a quasi-government organization that gave out a lot of funding to support families and youth in the area. But they had limited relationships in the community, and so they wanted to know what were the issues. We went out, we tapped into all sorts of community networks and organizations, and met with many leaders who didn't even know about this local quasi-government agency. We connected those leaders to the organization, helped them understand what this organization does and what resources it has, and then help the organization also understand that these are organizations and networks you don't even know about that's out there. And as a result, actually, some of the leaders were invited to be on the organization's board, or also actually on task forces, and therefore acquired access to resources and opportunities that way. I also recall another situation where we were evaluating the planning phase of an initiative. And one of the key findings was that, nonprofits were interviewed, and the leaders were interviewed were somewhat upset about the set of meetings in the community that the funder was organizing, because who the funder contacted first and where that meeting was being held was perceived as plain favoritism by that foundation. The truth can be said. The truth can be said about us, right? As evaluators, like, if we're doing focus groups, we're doing interviews, who do we contact first? Where do we hold these focus groups? All of that can be perceived as having preferential treatment based on how we look, who we represent, et cetera, et cetera. And then I think the last one is sort of, building, strengthening community capacity to use data for advocacy. This is often overlooked in our work in evaluation, and yet I think this is really part of racial equity work. Like, we have to make evaluation useful, not a mystery. We have to strengthen community members' skills to learn about data and evaluation, and to be able, I think more important, to be able to challenge data and findings that create harmful narratives about their community. Oftentimes, if community members and leaders are not familiar with data, they're just going to take it at face value. But, the data may be flawed. And how can they challenge that as well, so that it doesn't create harmful narratives about them? This is also often a piece of the work that doesn't get funded. And, as evaluators, you're doing the thing you're supposed to do, evaluate this initiative, and then you realize that these capacities are missing, and people need that information to be able to advocate for themselves. So how do you actually strengthen that skill set in communities? There are several other means for engaging community, so that the evaluations being done in service of racial equity, and mindful that we're trying to get communities to a place where they can influence the decisions that affect their lives, right? That they have access to opportunities and resources. And we're not going to go over all of them here because we don't have time, and I want to leave time for questions. So I'm going to turn to Alicia again. So all those things we talked about, community, about what it takes time to really learn, about being in relationship, about engaging people authentically. And what we hear from evaluators, there is no time. There's not enough budget to do this. What would you say in response to that comment, Alicia?
One, I think there are really great questions in the Q&A as well. And I would love to get to those. I think that if we're talking about, we talk a lot about dismantling things and addressing systemic inequities. This is one of the inequities. The idea that funding does not provide enough time for folks to do the work in equitable ways for you to be able to do, that's part of the issue. And it requires folks that are in that sphere of influence, right? Like, I have to leverage my capacity, right? My sphere of influence, because I am degreed. There are all kinds of ways that I have been legitimized when looking at my, right, multilingual, right, like many times undocumented, right, members of my community, right, in many ways. There are many ways in which I have to know myself and know the ways in which I can push, right, and be able to have conversations, to be able to have, to start to shift that kind of stuff. Because where the money is, where the resources are, where all those things do, that goes back to our inequitable relationships, and our inequitable processes do not beget equitable outcomes. And so it's really important for us to start to, oftentimes we do things, right, we go above and beyond right, we are not budgeted to do these things, and then we don't make that visible to the people who have hired us to do the work. So then it makes it look like it is easier to do the work than it is, right? Oh, well, they got it done in a year. But no one knows all of the things that you had to do, the intangibles that you brought to it because of who you are and your own, right, personal ways of knowing and being that you bring to that work. All of those things are essential for you to get the work done. And it's important that we start to paint a much more realistic picture of what we are actually doing in order to make this work done, so that there are funders, right? Because there are people who are talking to funders, right? We have Decolonizing Wealth and other books that have come out, and folks that are doing this work with funders specifically to help them understand it from the other end. We have to figure out where is our entry point to start to push people in different ways, and to ask the kinds of brilliant questions that you all are asking about how does this work, right? Like, how do I ask these questions? What questions do I ask? What questions don't I ask? And those are the things that I think are really, really important. I also think, and Ken and I talked about this, I was trained through, right, my interactions with my babas and elders and other folks that if we're talking about racism and white supremacy and all of these kind of things that have become jargony language, however, I was taught that white supremacy does two essential things. It makes us ahistorical and it truncates our imaginations. And so there is this notion of, there are history of people doing this work, right? Evaluating, researching. It may not be written in the books. It may not have been elevated to a level where it's considered, right, promising practice, but folks are doing this work all day, every day. And so there are ways in which we can figure out how to push against the time constraints and still do work that is moving us closer to the type of work that resonates with what we know and feel honors and is worthy of the folks with whom we get to work and do this with, right? It is not, I think there's also a shift in the way we imagine it. I was always taught that it is such a gift to have somebody come into the community and do work with us, when in fact it is a gift to be able to work with communities. And I talk to my students about this all the time. The radical candor of the impacted is a gift. Folks who are experiencing the types of challenges that many of our communities are experiencing, they don't have to tell us anything. They don't have to relive their traumas. They don't have to relive their experiences. They don't have to share any of that with us. And when they do, it is a gift, a valuable, valuable gift that we get exposure to. And so that's one of the things that I would say. But my personal thing is that we really need to start to push against these things and demonstrate that there are other ways to do this work. And sometimes you can do more than one thing at one time. We may think that it's just a focus group. It's just a time to do this. But it can be, you can get a multiplicity of things out of that, right? It can start to be a small win. It can start to be what we were talking about around these kind of like what we call solidarity strategies, when we're talking about ways for community to feel that it's consensual and there is reciprocity, right? What Ken was talking about around supporting them. If community members are trying to access things that they don't have access to, but we have access to it, breaking down that barrier can be a solidarity strategy. It can provide a step towards reciprocity, right? And making it a valuable exchange for the community. The community will tell you what it needs. But most folks don't ask, right? That is not even a question I have ever been asked when I am community organizing. No one comes in and asks and says, hey, I'm going to have you in a focus group for an hour. What would you want in return?
Yeah.
No one ever asked me that question.
Yeah. That is a great thing you just raised, because it's not a difficult thing to do, and yet we don't even think about it, right? Because we're just not trained to do that. We're going in, we're conducting a focus group, we're getting data, so we're being more extractive. But what do you bring in return? What's the gift you bring bearing to the people in there? And it's not just that compensation that we all want to do now, right? It's not just that gift certificate. It's more than that. And we have to really be thinking about intentionally.
Mm-hmm. There are some questions in the
Yeah, I'm going to actually run through this one last slide, and then I want to quickly turn to the Q&As, because this last one that I just want to mention really, it's about effective facilitation being essential, because this is not something evaluators are trained to do. We're not trained in facilitation. We're trained to go collect data, analyze data. It's the technical side of things. Yet, if we're going to do evaluations in service of racial equity, this is like essential. And I'm not going to run through them, but I want to talk about the empathy part. I think building empathy doesn't, as part of the process as evaluators, bringing gifts to bear, like bringing gifts to people. That doesn't make us less biased or less more biased or less objective. That doesn't make us that way. It makes us more human. It makes us think about the relationships we're in. So I just want to like home in on that. The other one is just tactics to respond to bias. This is something we don't think about. We have encountered so many of these situations, mistakes we've made, and other evaluators have committed, and that lessons and experience we've learned. You know, you're in the middle of an interview, you're in the middle of a focus group, you're in the middle of a meeting, and someone says something that is offensive, that reflects prejudice, ignorance. How do you handle that situation? It's not that you're going to be objective of like, I'm going to ignore it, I'm going to collect data and move on. It's a moment for something. And as change agents, it's a moment that we should be able to seize. How do you seize it? Goes back to the relationships you have, goes back to the way you're prepared to respond, goes back to your skills. So I just want to point that out, because even in training our staff or our teams for interviewing for focus group, this has to be part of the training. When this comes up, how do you respond, right? Practice those scenarios, because in that moment, it can get heated, it can get very difficult, it can be right, often scary, but it's something for us to think about very intentionally upfront. So with that, I just want to say, like, these are the resources. You'll find more about facilitation resources also in this guide. And if you can't do it as the evaluator, look for a partner. Make sure that your team includes somebody who has those skills. That's important. We've done that several times, where you can call them some sort of learning facilitator or anybody else, but someone with those skills, other than you if you don't have them. So with that, I just want to then go to the questions. And there's so many. So I'm going to pick one right now. There's a question in there about what advice, might you have, Alicia, about improving equity within relationships and processes between, say, funders and communities? Is there one or two things you think we can start with that starts to move the relationship towards equity? I can't say that it will always be equitable, but at least moves in that direction. Any advice on that?
Yeah, I think that's Lily. I think that's how I pronounce her name. Lily.
Yep.
Yeah, I really, it's not rocket. Like, I feel like people are always asking me, like when I worked with some government agencies in child welfare, they were always asking me for, one, I don't have a lot of answers. I have lots of questions. And two, they thought it was supposed to be some sort of like really like, magical like answer, right? And so I would argue that what I do is there's a book called Emergent Strategy, right? It really it's by a woman named Adrienne Marie Brown, and they really write about how what we do in the small, right, reflects in the large. And so how we relate to each other, how we speak to each other, how we develop our relationships, how we decide to work together. All of these things are ways in which we improve relationships and processes, because how we engage with each other on an interpersonal level starts to, people make up, right, institutions. And so that's also how we learn how to then show up in places like communities, right? About how curious are you about people that you work with. That also can demonstrate how curious you are when it comes to asking more questions than bringing answers when you're dealing with a community. And so I argue that the messiness that is human nature, that is humans, right? Like that, the work that we do, the more that we bring that into our and make it transparent that that is what we are doing in our engagements with each other in things like a place like, right, being a funder, and how we talk about our power dynamics and how we feel whether or not we can say and show up as our authentic selves and what that means, right? Those things can be extrapolated out to how we engage with our community. If I, as a person with a PhD, doesn't feel that I am valued or that my contributions are valued when I am talking to a funder, then it is very difficult for me to then go out to be an evaluator and think and not be able to think about how that could also be happening when I'm talking to a community member who now is looking at me, right, as a person who, right, like I have to make sure that I'm extrapolating out how I need to correct those types of inequities that happen in relationships, right? Power imbalances and things like that. I hope that makes sense, Ken. But it's really about learning those types of things and making sure that you are course correcting for those in your relationships, right? And in your processes, because how we relate to each other is how we develop our processes. If I develop a process that just works for me, it demonstrates that I am not paying attention to, or I'm not curious about those that I am working with. That then is extrapolated out when I go into community as well.
Yeah, I think I hear you. I think what you said brings up two things for me. One is that it's a process. It's a relationship process. You're not going to get it right off the bat, right? And so I think being comfortable and uncomfortable is part of the process. I think we often see it as like this thing at the end we're supposed to have, but it's really the journey. Although I hate using that word, but it is sort of like the journey that is like the destination. It's not like you get to that point.
And you don't get it right all the time.
Exactly.
Like that's the humanness of it, right?
Yeah.
Like I think there's something that we have learned in social justice or equity work, that there is some place that you arrive at where you never make a mistake again, because you've learned enough to never make that mistake again. And my argument is we will always be making mistakes, but it's the way in which we treat each other when we make those mistakes. It's the way in which we honor that we, right? It may mean it changes your seat on the bus, right? Accountability is big, and and natural consequences to actions are a thing, right? And you can do harm and folks have to let you know how to address that harm. However, if we're talking about transformative justice and other things that honor that the humanity in each other, we really have to start to bring those things into how we engage every day, because we're going to make mistakes in community. I see a lot of questions in here that are talking about like, when do we get it just right? How do we make it just fair? Is it the best thing to do? The community will tell you that. None of those things work. None of those things translate over time and space. What works for a community today? I mean, I've been working with my community in New Orleans pre and post Katrina. The things that are needed that we are talking about today are not the things we were talking about 2 years ago. And so what we would have asked somebody to do for our community 2 years ago is not what we would ask today. So if we were in the same engagement with the evaluator, the ball would have moved.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it brings to mind two things, what you just said. One is humility, right? Like if you know that you can make like going into something with a humility that like you could make a mistake. You don't know everything. You know, and you and I talked about this. I talked about this with our last speaker, Glenn Harris, about just, you know, we come thinking because we have degrees of some sort, we know the answers. You gotta come in with some humility that you don't know the answers, so that when you do make that mistake, it's okay, right? Because you're learning and you're setting up that value in the relationship from the start. It's a reciprocal process where you're learning and the other person's learning. One. Two, it makes me think about the community. When we say community, what I didn't talk about is our community as evaluation practitioners, right? The community we have to build among ourselves to be able to call each other out sometimes, and to be able to, you know, when you're in that uncomfortable situation and maybe you just committed a huge mistake and you feel like crap, like who in your community you turn to and say like, oh my God, I made this huge mistake, and have some trusted person in your community say, it's okay, you learn, don't do it again next time, right? Like you have to be in community for yourself. And I think that's important. I remember when we did this workshop at the American Evaluation Association, and Hazel Simonet brought this up. You know, it's about how do you actually, you know, sometimes you take a risk. You take a risk as an evaluator to say something that's unpopular. You could risk your job, you could risk the contract, everything. and you need a community to fall back on. You need that support, right? So I think our own community we have to think about. So when you said that, it made me think of those two things.
Absolutely. I think Yasmin said something in the, I think that's how you pronounce their name, said that there's a fine line between collecting data and offering something you cannot deliver. I absolutely believe that you do not want to overpromise and underdeliver, but I also think that's a part of transparency, authenticity, and having a relationship, being fully who you are. And I know, look, as a queer, Black, right, gender fluid woman, there are all kinds of ways in which, right, I struggle with my own authenticity in many spaces, right? But the more I am able to, because that's what I'm asking for community members to do with me when I am engaging with them, they are being vulnerable, they are doing all of these things, and I have to bring that out too. I have to talk about this process, how conflicted I am, the things that I have, the questions I have, the ways in which, right, that making light of that and making that visible is incredibly important. It humanizes the process. It humanizes us. It humanizes the relationship between researcher and community, or whatever we want to talk about that, right? All of that is essential because that's part of equity work. Like, we talk about racism, right? And racism dehumanizes us all of us, in different ways. And so the more we put the humanness back into all of these things that foundationally may have been born out of racist systems, racist processes, racist, whatever we want to call it, the more we get back to something that honestly starts to honor each of us, and then collectively, right, groups of us, as whole people, as whole individuals, right? And so I really think that's important. It sounds simple, but like we teach my preschoolers, bucket dippers and bucket fillers. It's a preschool book. And we talk about how you have to fill your bucket before you dip out of somebody's bucket. It seems so fundamentally easy, but we don't think about doing that as adults. We miss some of these basic human interaction needs that have to come in, especially when you're engaging with folks that are experiencing historical, right, traumas that you all are now coming in and evaluating and learning about.
Yeah, and because we're also trained not to do that, right? We're trained to think of that as bias, and it's not science anymore, that we're not rigorous anymore when we do that, and that's part of the challenge. So remember a conversation with a funder one time when we said, like, we're committed to social justice. We believe that, we have a social justice agenda as evaluators. That's what we want. We were told right off the bat, like, doesn't that make you biased? That makes you not scientists anymore. Right? And that's where the system is set up so that it's hard for us to do that. And as I said earlier, and I think you mentioned too, it's not just us who needs to change, right? It's the whole ecosystem. There's a question in the Q&A that I want to ask, because this has come up over and over again, and we've tried to figure out what's the best answer, if there is one. It's from David. What is fair compensation for community involvement? And oftentimes now you hear like, oh, if you're going to do focus groups, if you're going to do interviews, you want to pay the person. Yes, you want to, but like, $20, $50, $100, this question always comes up. Just curious what you think.
I mean, my students will tell you, like, so I work with a collective of 150 young people in New Orleans who are aged 10 to 25. And they're quick to say sometimes it's not about money, right? Like, because they also they've started to talk about capitalism and its connection to racism and all of these kinds of things. And they're like, there are lots of other things that we need that may not be $20, right? We may need some resources. We may need some things. Again, many of these questions that you are asking to me as not a member of the communities that you are talking about need to be directed to the folks that you are working with. These are conversations that you have to have with them. You cannot decide these things ahead of time. You have to that's part of the relationship, and really being honest about those things. There are many questions that we think that we can answer before we engage with community actually are essential to making sure that the engagement with the community is worthy, by sitting down and having those conversations with those folks in and of themselves. And that's what it means. When people say, how do you define success? Again, a conversation to have with the community, right? How do you define, right? Like, these are conversations that require co-creation with the same folks that you are hopefully working with, right? And not on or for. And so that's what I would say about that. Many times I've thought about that, and sometimes they'll tell you there's not enough compensation.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can't equally compensate me, and I'm still willing to do it, but I'm honoring that this is, you just can't, right? Like what I'm sharing with you for, right, the good of future generations, you cannot equally compensate me for. And I'm clear because I understand my value, and that may be it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
There's a note in there just about the difference between true engagement, quote unquote, of community members and just engagement, which could be lip service. Isn't community-based participatory research, CBPR, the best way to truly engage community members in evaluation? I know my response to this, and I'll be curious about your response, Alicia. You can do CBPR, and it doesn't mean that you're doing it in an equitable way.
Yep.
So I will still say that may be a methodology, but it's still a methodology that can have a lot of inequity. So I don't think it's the best way. I don't think there's like a methodology that would say like this is the way to do it. I think it's in the process, and it's in understanding community engagement and what it means for that community you're trying to engage, and in that relationship process. That's how I would respond to that.
Absolutely. Here's my thing. It's who's using the tool that makes the difference between how the tool is used. And so for me, the conversation becomes, if there was ever a way, we would have already dismantled racism if it was as easy as determining a tool that could not allow inequity like racism to happen, right? Like that is not how this thing works. We are human. So the minute we take on, right, any of these tools, all of our strengths, but also our limitations, our right areas of growth, they also come along with that. And if we think that we can divorce the person that is wielding said tool from, right, what happens with that tool, I think that's why we still are where we are in this conversation about social justice, because we continue to obscure the kinds of things that we need to pay attention to. Like we need to know ourselves, and we need to be really honest with ourselves, and we need to be really clear that we have struggles, we have biases, we have all of these things, and all of those things come with us, whether we like it or not. We don't leave them at home.
Yeah. We have about 30 seconds left. So just a quick one, right? Is there one piece of advice you would give for evaluators who say like, you're going in to evaluate, you're dropping in, you have to go learn about community. Well, you're an outsider, community's not going to trust you. What's the one thing you think they can start with?
So I'll go back to emergent strategy, right? I believe that what you pay attention to grows, and ultimately, you do not know what's going to happen until you actually strike out and attempt to do it. I think you need to be honest. I think you need to bring that up. I think somebody said about what are the questions to ask. You need to ask those things. You may not be the person to do the work, right? Like that piece of work, and that is okay too, because there is enough work out here for us to do, and it may not be that we can do it with every community. But I honestly think that there is that we underestimate the power of relationship, right? And being able to forge relationships across differences when we are authentic to who we are, and we are honest about our humanness and the messiness and all of the things that come with that. I think when folks have engaged me in my community from that lens, it has always been a much different experience than I even thought I had the capacity to trust.
Great. Thank you, Alicia. It's 3 o'clock. Well, it's 3 o'clock our time, Eastern Standard Time. I know there might be different time zones here. So I want to respect everyone's time. I want to thank Alicia so much for being part of this. It's so much. It was great learning from you, Alicia. Want to thank Dante, who's been helping behind the scenes, and Wilan, who couldn't be here today. But I just want to thank everybody for participating. Thank you for your time, and I hope that you found some use of this. Again, for those of you that might have missed it, we will be sending out the recordings and links to resources once all 3 webinars have been concluded. The third one is on Thursday at 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful day, everybody.